Good morning. Unless I put the wrong name tag on, my name is Steve Toffel, and I am the president of Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Dartmouth, or Osher at Dartmouth for short. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here in person with you and welcoming you to our 25th summer lecture series. For those who are here in person at Spalding Auditorium, and many of you, over 200 of you who are joining us virtually, I want to take a couple of minutes to thank those who have chaired our series over the years for the past quarter century. But first, I want to thank the members of the Summer Lecture Series Committee for the incredible amount of work that went into making this presentation possible. I'd like to ask those who are on the committee to please rise. If you're here at home, you can stay seated. Thank you very much. Thank you. The Summer Lecture Series was conceived of and inaugurated in 1997 by David Bisnow, who was by then a seasoned Iliad study leader, and it took much convincing, hard work, and dedication to get this series off the ground. Since then, it has become Osher's signature event. I want to thank David, and hoping he's here, would you please stand up? Way in the back. Thank you. David was assisted by retired Admiral Ed Kintner and my dad, Joe Toffel, who's watching us from home with my mom. In 2004, Bruce McDonald took over the chair and ran the series for the next decade and took it to new heights. In 2015, Tom Blinkhorn agreed to lead the committee for a year and produced a remarkable series. The next 4 years were led by John Ferries and our former president, Pete Blyler. I believe that Pete is here today, and I'd like him to also stand up again. Pete, this is how I'm starting your exercise program. In 2019, our former president, Ann Hargraves, and Roland Kuchel took over, only to have their debut ruined by COVID when we were forced to cancel the 2020 series. 2021 was almost as bad in that we couldn't meet here at Spalding and were forced to offer the series online only. Finally, after what seems to many of us to be an eternity, we are back here in person, listening to live lectures and soon to be eating real cookies. It's my genuine pleasure to welcome you all back and turn the floor over to our co-chair, Ann Hargraves. Ann and Roland, thank you so much for getting us to our 25th. Ann?
Good morning. As Steve explained, some of us are here in Spalding Auditorium and some are remote using Vimeo. I've heard of it, but I don't know it. We have members from 3 different Osher programs joining us remotely. Welcome to members of our sister programs, Granite State Ollie in Concord, New Hampshire, UMass in Boston, University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. Our question and answer period is always one of the most attractive of this series. Those of you in Spalding were given an index card on entering the auditorium. Please write your questions on this card and submit them to me and Sylvia at the break. There's also a wooden box on stage for you to drop your question cards into. And it's right there. For those of you joining us remotely, there is a chat window. If you would like to give your name and where you are from, submit your questions there. Will, our student intern, will be writing these questions on other index cards and giving them to the moderator at the break. You can continue to submit questions after the break during the Q&A, but it's not assured that those questions can be answered. This year we've got something new, and it is an after-session debriefing. There are 15 spaces available for anyone who would like to attend the first lecture debrief session from 11:45 to 12:15 in Faulkner Recital Hall downstairs in the Hop. Diane Doe, an Osher staff member, will take the group down the stairs. There will be, from our speaker, Jim Campbell, a book signing. He will be signing his book called Polarized, Making Sense of a Divided America in the hallway near the Courtyard Cafe. Thanks to our underwriters who underwrite the whole series, Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Kendall at Hanover, The Village at White River Junction, Wells Fargo Advisors, and our sponsor for this week, Mascoma Bank and Mariner Wealth Advisors. Sylvia Paxton is the person who recruited Jim Campbell to come and speak to us today, and she will come now and she will tell you all about Jim.
Hi there. It's nice to be among my Osher friends again for the first time in what seems years. Hi there. I'm making a few introductory remarks about Jim today. And I don't know if it's been true for you, but my professors were always sort of like my parents. They were special, and I didn't really see them in the same way as I see the rest of the people as human. So I thought I'd just make a couple of remarks. You've been able to read about Jim in the program, and so I thought I would humanize him a wee bit. He was born in Portland, Maine. He has 4 younger brothers. I can't imagine what Mrs. Campbell did with 5 boys. He graduated from Bowdoin Phi Beta Kappa. He is retiring from his position at SUNY University of Buffalo in 23 more days, which is exciting for him. His CV is 25 pages on both sides. So his highlights, which he sent to me of the events in his career, involved presentations, meetings with people on both sides of the aisle. He lives with his wife on Peaks Island, Maine, 25-minute ferry ride from Portland, and they live with cats and a singing basset hound. But here's the best part. He is a Red Sox and Patriots fan, which has not been terribly welcome in Buffalo with the Buffalo Bills. It's been great fun to get to know him. Here's Jim Campbell.
Great. Well, thank you, Sylvia, for that wonderful introduction. I was a little concerned when I heard that they were going to tell everything about me. So, but I'm glad it was the highlights were there. So, I also am delighted to be here. I'm delighted to see all of you in attendance and welcome the many people watching this remotely. And I think we'll be dealing with some very important subjects and developments in American politics over the next 45 minutes or so. And I also want to thank the Osher people and all the sponsors that are crucial to putting something like this together. It's unusual for a professor to have this kind of treatment. I feel a little bit like a rock star coming in. There's a green room and another green room, and people sort of looking out for, do you have enough water and all this, and it's not your typical class setting. So my comments today deal with the crisis in American politics that's associated with polarization. And this is a topic that's been certainly in the press and discussed among political observers and everyday citizens for some time now. And it's really got a lot of attention back in the late 80s, early 90s, when it first became seen or talked about as part of the culture wars. I think perhaps the beginning of this was at the 1988 Republican convention, when Pat Buchanan spoke about the culture war, and a lot of people didn't take it so seriously then, but it's developed over time. Some in political science were skeptical, or thought that this was only this polarization was only a matter among political elites or the political activists sort of at the top, and everybody else, sort of the everyday person, was still a moderate, as they had been described, going well back to the 50s. It's clear now that that view was wrong, that we were highly polarized, and a couple of years ago, I wrote a book that tried to go back and sort of start from the beginning and really pin down the crucial developments and changes and all the different kinds of evidence that can be brought to bear on this question about why are we polarized, how polarized are we, how is it developed, and so forth. So that's sort of the core of the first part of my discussion. But since I wrote the book back in 2016 and 2018 was the afterward, there have been other developments that frankly I didn't anticipate, and we'll be discussing those as well. So there's a lot to deal with. Let me make sure this is, let's see. Here we go. This is the beginning. There's a great deal to deal with in sort of dissecting the American the crisis in American polarization. How has that harmed American politics? What threat does it pose to American politics? And the subtitle here is The Rise of Modern Feudalism and the Decline of Civic Values, which is sort of the major consequence of the developments in recent years. And my presentation will get into the details of that, particularly the decline of civic values. Now, this is a huge subject, and I prepared a mammoth PowerPoint presentation. I was told I could take several hours for this. No. So I'm timing myself to try to get everything in for 50 minutes, because I understand the cookies are very important, and we need to get to those as soon as possible. So I've organized this in essentially 6 chapters, and this is sort of thinking forward to my next book, actually, and sort of this is the core of it. First, as the opening lecture in this series, I wanted to cover some groundwork about what do we mean by political ideology and what do we mean by polarization, just so we have some, and those are central concepts that are often glossed over. And I want to make sure we pin those down to understand, we have a common understanding of what's involved. Then I'd like to discuss 3 misunderstandings about polarization. Three factors that are often asserted and really are not true, not accurate. Then I've tried to boil the thesis down into a nutshell, to a summary, just in case I go well over the 2 hours that I planned for this. So you get the core of it. And then look at the findings about polarization, which generally summarize some of the key points in my book, and the 3 developments in polarization that have occurred since, that have made a bad situation worse and more threatening to the basic operations of democracy, something we really have to contend with. And I hope we can get into that for a couple reasons. One is, as in looking toward the other lectures in this series, some of those will be dealing with matters that can affect the consequences of polarization for the better or for the worse. I mean, it is possible, I think, as we've seen, as bad as things are, that they can get worse. So we don't want to actually exacerbate an already bad problem. So I think understanding how we've gotten into this mess is important to understanding, I think, how we can perhaps get out of it, what's likely to make it worse or perhaps make it a little bit better. And finally, this is a little specialized, but back in 1955, and I'll talk more about this at the end, back in 1955, in a period that is generally considered kind of placid in American politics, you know, it was a fairly calm political era, Louis Hartz wrote a book that sort of in a whole movement or genre of social commentators, social thought scholars. I wrote a book called The Liberal Tradition in America, and by that he meant the Lockean liberal tradition, why America had somehow been spared a lot of the ideological strife that they had recently seen over the previous couple of decades in Europe, very ideological, critical battles. So I'll talk about his thesis and how it can be applied to our current political situation at the end. So I should first, also in preparation for the full talk, offer a caveat. The focus of my comments will be on the nature of the crisis, because I think that's critical to understanding how it might be solved. We have to know exactly what it is. But the solutions are speculative, and so I hope a lot of you offer some suggestions on these index cards you have, so how we can get out of this mess that we've gotten ourselves into. So first, some groundwork on ideology and polarization. What is political ideology and what is political polarization? First, political ideology is a concept that's amazingly people have a huge number of ideas. Scholars and political practitioners over the years have offered many different ideas about what is entailed in a political ideology. And I think for the most part, they've made a simple matter too complex. And so for the purposes of my discussion, an ideology is simply a person's core values that may be used in judging what is politically good or bad, right or wrong. So it's just your sense about what's right in politics, what is the right course. So that can be applied in all kinds of different settings, or not. You may just take a very practical approach to things and set your ideology aside. So the person may or may not use these values consistently or be aware or able to articulate them. And this is very important. A lot of people, these are core beliefs. And we know when approached by a survey researcher, people aren't always able to dig into the core of their thinking to reveal it to a survey research person. They're not just walking around prepared to answer a comprehensive exam question. So and this is important because a lot of people, political leaders, I mean, that's their business. They deal with these matters all the time. So they're much better able to convey what their core beliefs are. And sometimes they want to hide them, but they're better. They know them, whereas a lot of people are not that self-conscious about their core beliefs. Nearly all people. So the upshot of this is that nearly all people have a political ideology, a sense of right and wrong in politics. Now, the big tent ideologies, liberalism and conservatism, contain within them many variants. This is a complaint you often hear about ideology. Well, ideology is just a label. There are, liberals disagree among themselves, conservatives disagree among themselves. Well, I mean, that's true actually of any group characteristic. Not all conservatives hold the same set of values, or all liberals hold the same set of values, or hold them in the same degree, or always apply them, or apply them in the same way. There are variants, just as all Catholics don't agree on everything, and all Democrats are Buddhists, or English professors. Well, maybe that's an exception, but there's variance. Each rose is a bit different, but they are all roses, and they are not daisies. So you can, within that class, it is meaningful for somebody to say that they're a liberal or a conservative or a moderate. That does mean something. It doesn't mean they're all identical. And sometimes that's the standard used to reject the idea that people can be ideological. So what is political polarization? So that's one key term that I think we want to pin down. Second term is political polarization. What is political polarization? It's essentially an us versus them politics, where there's a clear, intense conflict, substantial differences, and really involves two elements. There are substantial differences on important political perspectives, most commonly a single ideological spectrum, from left to right, from liberals to conservatives. And I mean, it could conceivably go beyond, the spectrum can be broadened even further than that. And so that's one element, substantial differences on important political perspectives. And second, political conflicts are overlapping or reinforcing rather than cross-cutting. That is, all kinds of differences kind of line up the same way. They align themselves the same way. I've got some graphics here to show you. So this is a relatively unpolarized public of little smiley faces. This would generally be called pluralism. You have some people who are further to the edge of the space, and some people more concentrated in the middle, and you have different dividers through here that cut in different ways. So back in the 60s and 70s, this was called pluralism, to describe American politics. And what was important about that is that you would have, on any particular issue, somebody might be your ally, and on a different issue, they might be your opponent. And so you didn't have us versus them. It depended on the issue. And the consequences of that are pretty clear, that should moderate conflict. If somebody's going to be on your side on some other issues, then you're not going to just demonize them, right? So this is essentially the same lineup, but now all of these issues cut the same way. All these different ways of dividing the country are reinforcing. So you have more extremes, and the divisions are reinforcing. So you have this us versus them politics. So this is, we think of polarization sometimes, at least in political science, as a recent topic. But really it goes back to understanding social conflict, social political conflict. Back in the 50s and 60s, that conflict was was pluralistic, so it was muted. So we had cross-cutting and more centrist views, so intensity of political conflict was lower. Now, more at the other end of the scale, the polarization end of the scale, where you have reinforcing or sordid political views and more extremism. So those are two things to understand. That is political ideology and polarization in order to get into understanding what the crisis amounts to. Second major topic is looking at three misunderstandings about polarization. First understanding is that some people believe ideological polarization is impossible because most Americans are not capable of thinking ideologically. This is a common belief, and actually a lot of political scientists don't believe it, because they go back to studies of like the American voter study in the 60s, and they asked the National Election Study asked people, what is it that you like or you dislike about the Democratic candidate or the Democratic Party, the Republican candidate, Republican Party? And those open-ended questions, the responses to the open-ended questions were evaluated, and they found, well, people were saying, well, he's good for labor, or the times are good. Sort of superficial kinds of things. But again, people were answering off the top of their head. They weren't digging down deep into why they think it's good or bad. So Philip Converse said, ideological thinking is not common. Well, ideology was defined and measured far too narrowly. It wasn't just sophistication. Actually, when you think about it, ideology doesn't have to be sophisticated at all, and we always talk about it in that way. There are wingnut conservatives, and there are knee-jerk liberals, right? I mean, these are just responses, the gut-level responses. They're values. They're based on values. You could probably get people to articulate them and think about more what they are, but basically, it's core values. So ideologies do not require sophisticated thinking, and because of that, virtually everybody has a political ideology. Maybe not the nihilists, for those who recall the Big Lebowski and the battle against the nihilists, but it's a common trait. Second, sorting was thought as an alternative to polarization. That is, Americans did not become more polarized, they became better sorted. Well, this is that is, the liberals went off into the Democratic Party, conservatives went off into the Republican Party. They're just better sorted than they had been. This, I think, misunderstands it too. Sorting, or the alignment of people, is not an alternative to polarization. It's one of the processes creating polarization. So polarization is greater when differences among people are sorted or reinforce differences rather than dividing people in pluralistic ways. So, again, you have allies and adversaries on different issues. So, again, in this case, you have lots of extremists, but they're not sorted. They're on different issues, or you have different allies or adversaries. If you take that same configuration and sort it, now you have polarization. So people didn't have to become more extreme in their views to become more polarized. That is, they just lined up better, that is, more consistently. as liberals and conservatives. The third misconception or misunderstanding is that social group polarization, which has been called political sectarianism. Now, let me just say a word about that. So the idea is that, that some people have is that, again, going back to the first misunderstanding that ideology was impossible among average people, that just groups are at each other's throats over political matters, and there's no ideological backing to that. It's just some people hate some other people, and other people get along with some other people. In the journal Science, a group of political scientists advocated this idea that we have social group polarization, or political sectarianism, as they called it, and it's not based on ideological polarization. I think that's absolutely wrong. We have political sectarianism, but it is in fact based on ideology. People are sorted now more on ideological terms across the board. So social group polarization is based on ideological polarization. It takes a common single reason to politically polarize society, to take all these diverse social groups and have them lining up against one another. There has to be a reason for it. And it has to be a reason that's a single reason to get this common division in society. So it's no mere coincidence also, it's no mere coincidence that the public became socially polarized after it had become ideologically polarized. So ideological polarization came first, and then has seeped into all of our other social contacts and occupational contacts and associations. So nearly everyone has a political ideology. Sorting is a process to become polarized, and ideological polarization is the basis for social polarization. So that sets up the thesis here. The thesis in a nutshell. First, Americans became ideologically polarized in the late 1960s. So this is not as recent a process as some people think. And they've become more polarized since then. Now, why weren't we aware of how polarized we were up until the 90s and the 2000s? Well, part of the reason is, and I think a big part of the reason is that the parties back in the 70s and 80s, just more in the 70s and less so in the 80s, muted polarization. You still had a lot of liberal Republicans representing us in Congress and conservative Democrats representing us in Congress. So they muted polarization. Now they accentuate it. So party polarization came along after the public had become pretty well polarized. So party polarization followed in the 1990s, but the spread did not stop there. Polarization is and this is, I think, a very important point. Polarization is a bottom-up phenomenon, that it started with the public. And for a while, the parties did not represent the public very well, the polarized views of the public. And we saw in the 1970s and 1980s, for instance, we saw a decline in partisanship. We saw more split-ticket voting. We saw lower turnout. All of those are indications that the public's not satisfied that they're getting representation for their views. So the public was polarized. The parties were still this kind of mishmash, Democrats a little bit to the left, Republicans a little bit to the right, and that's the way it was. And so a lot of conservatives weren't satisfied with the kind of wishy-washy the Republican Party, and a lot of liberals weren't satisfied with the wishy-washy Democratic Party. And so they were less likely to identify with the party, more likely to split their tickets, and turnout suffered as well. But that changed once the parties themselves became more polarized. We saw all of those indicators turn up. That is, people became more partisan, split ticket voting declined, turnout increased. So there is a good side to polarization in that sense. That party polarization is representing a polarized public. So we have some consistency across that. The next part of the summary is ideological polarization. This gets into the development. Ideological polarization is now enveloping everyday lives. When I finished the book, I thought, okay, so social differences affect the political polarization. So your background, your experiences, all that affects your partisanship, your ideological views, and so forth. But I didn't really take into account that too, that political polarization would also have an influence on your social relationships. And I think this has deepened, it's really made polarization pervasive. It's not just limited to politics. Politics now is sort of infused social, occupational, it's everything. It's absorbed into all lines. And the social extension of ideological polarization is along socioeconomic, class, particularly educational lines. And we've heard a lot about how the college-educated Americans are moving more toward the Democratic Party. The working class, non-college educated Americans that used to be sort of the core of the Democratic Party are now moving in the Republican direction. So there's that is another element of that sorting that produces the us versus them political conflict. The mechanisms for why is this happening? Well, this is kind of interesting from the standpoint of how I made these connections. I was teaching a class on public opinion, and I would teach polarization, but I also taught about influence, social network influences, and influences of sort of society, social pressures. And two books were crucial to this. One was a book by Diana Mutz called Hearing the Other Side. And she did a study of how, this was like 2008, I think it was this study. She did a study of who talks to who, what social networks are formed, and do people talk and listen to people who agree with them or to people who disagree, have different views? And she found overwhelmingly that people form social networks, that is, they discussed politics with people they agree with. And they stay away from talking about politics with people they disagree with. And it makes sense from a standpoint that basically people don't want to work. They don't want to work at social relationships, right? They don't want to argue, get into arguments with people. There's sort of a conflict aversion. And people like to be reinforced, have their views reinforced. They don't want to be challenged. And so they take the comfortable route out. That is, they steer toward people who share their views. Now, and away from those that don't. Elizabeth Noel Newman's book sort of continued this. This is an earlier book, but continued the process. That is, if you're in a group in which, her book was called The Spiral of Silence, if you're in a group that you understand has a dominant political view, people tend to either adopt that view or just stay quiet about their dissent. They just shut up about it. They don't want to stand out because of the possibility of being ostracized or criticized or shunned in some way. It may just be completely informal, but people do that. So these are two social pressures. There's a general preference for people to associate with like-minded people and social pressures for them to conform with views of your peers. You want to fit in. Now, so this is how ideology has seeped into all these social networks. Because, if you just look at like identity politics, sort of crude identity politics, that is, demographics, race, ethnicity, gender, all those, the correlations between those characteristics and political views are quite weak. But that doesn't mean that social relationships don't have a strong effect on your politics. That is, they're refined by ideology. Ideology tends to structure those. So you join groups that are like-minded. So pervasive polarization has created a crisis in democratic values. This is the last component of this nutshell summary. Pervasive polarization has created a crisis in democratic civic values. It's reduced the levels of trust in government and in authority in general. When we talk, I'll show you some data on this in a moment. When we talk about how conservatives don't believe in science, well, you look at it, and it's likely that they believe in scientists, but they don't believe in scientists. That scientists are coming from a different ideological perspective. And so it kind of fits this idea that people want to hear and associate with those that they agree with and are skeptical of those that they disagree with. So this polarization, this pervasive polarization, has reduced the levels of trust in government and authority in general in all kinds of venues. It's decreased political tolerance, and it has actually decreased national pride or patriotism. We've seen all of that, so that's the summary of this. Let's get into the details, so I'm not just making this up. I'm skeptical of myself, so I think skepticism these days is well warranted. So first, we'll start before polarization actually got underway, and before polarization. So we're talking about the 1950s and early 60s, late 40s through early 60s. So this is after the experience of the Great Depression and World War II. Americans were relatively unpolarized. I think this marks polarization as, or the lack of polarization, as the unusual circumstance. The generation that was most of the American public back in the 40s and 50s had experienced the Great Depression, which unified people. No matter what your background was, it unified people. The World War II experience, everybody participated, all males participated in World War II, and that was a bonding. Americans were more bonded together, so relatively unpolarized. There were significant political differences, but we weren't polarized. Ideological heterogeneous parties muted ideological conflict. And Americans were generally seen as more centrist and pragmatic than ideological. Actually, there was a sort of a social thought movement about the end of ideology in the 1950s, and Louis Hart's book was part of that. Comedian Mort Saul at the time, he's sort of the poor man's, the one who was always arrested for, Lenny Bruce, thank you. The poor man's Lenny Bruce, in a way, said voters were offered a choice in the 1956 election between the extremes of Eisenhower's gradualism and Stevenson's extremism, or moderation, rather. So you basically had, the division was here, not like that. That was the calm before the storm of the late 1960s. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the greatest generation, my parents, who went through the Depression and World War II, they became a smaller portion of the electorate. And ungalvanized, I mean, the earlier generation had been galvanized by those crises. The baby boomers weren't. We were free to, we celebrated freedom of arguing, of taking whatever extreme positions we could take. Plus, there was a growing number of contentious issues and political events. So the American public became increasingly polarized. This is just a quick summary. Turmoil replaced tranquility. You had civil rights conflicts, marches, sit-ins, police confrontations, urban unrest, Vietnam War, the Weathermen, the Black Panthers. This is rock and roll in Woodstock replaced Lawrence Welk. So this was a major cultural revolution, and showed up. And of course, many events also were exacerbated this. The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. So we had this Archie Bunker versus the son-in-law, meathead. That was the division. Hard hats versus the radicals, and everybody sort of chose up sides. Americans became quite polarized in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Here's some of the evidence. I went back and looked at 5 different general sources of survey data on political ideology, and this really started in 1972. It's surprising that we didn't have really good earlier data on this. But 1972, using these 5 different indicators, American National Election Study, Gallup, the exit polls, CBS, New York Times, the country was about 18% liberals, 31% conservatives, and 51% moderates. If you group the liberals and conservatives together as ideologues, the nation was 51% moderate and 49% ideological. Now, how do we interpret that? 49% ideological is still a very ideological country. It's not like everybody's in the center. You have, if you had 25% and 25% on either wing, just detesting each other, half the country would still be moderate, but you'd have a lot of conflict. And I think that's what we had in 1972. Things became more polarized, have gotten more polarized since then. Again, using the same data sources. See, liberals have increased from 18%. This is 2021 actually the top here, the key is incorrect in this case. So I changed the colors. So the ideologicals are in tan and the moderates are in blue. So liberals increased from 18 to 24%, from 72 to now, present day. And conservatives increased a little bit as well. And it's all been at the expense of the center. If you look at this, again, grouping liberals and conservatives together for the purposes of saying, who's polarized versus who's still nicely in the middle. The moderates have declined from 51 to 42%, and ideologicals have increased from 49 to 58%, a change of 9 points, 9 percentage points. In macro American politics, that is about what happened during the New Deal realignment that shifted the country from a more Republican-oriented country to a Democratic-oriented country. So a 9-point shift in overall is a huge shift. And it's particularly important when you think about where the parties are getting their votes from. In the old days, both parties got a large percentage of their votes from moderates. Now they get a much larger percentage of their votes from their ideological wings. And they're going to represent those wings commensurately better as a result. And the third of the previous findings is that the polarization of the public preceded the polarization of the parties. Again, this was a bottom-up process, not top-down. America is polarized not because that's being imposed on them. It's because we are polarized. And the parties are simply reflecting this a lot better. It took them a while to respond. And if you think about it, it makes sense. You have a lot of people who are conservative Democrats who are elected. They aren't going to just change over to be give up their seats to conservative Republicans in those areas. And you had liberal Democrats, conservative Democrats. So it took a long time for that to shift. And we saw the incumbency advantage. People were holding on to their position. This is the DW Nominate scores. There's a group that takes all of the roll call votes in the House and in the Senate for each member and scales them. And they've gone back to the first Congresses to scale how were the divisions between the parties. What single dimension best summarizes all of their votes. And this was in 1971 and 73, and we can see in this case the blue dots here, the liberal conservative dimension is the horizontal dimension. Of course, there are other kinds of votes as well, but the basic dimension is the horizontal dimension. And we can see in the boxed-in area, there's still a lot of moderate Democrats. Those are the blue dots in the middle box. And a lot of moderate Republicans, the red dots in the middle box. So the parties, if you think about it, you can put names on some of these. You can see like Jacob Javits in New York was a liberal Republican. You see some conservative Democrats as well throughout the South. This jumps ahead to 2011, 2013, and you can see the center is emptied out. Now, if you're a Republican, you're much more likely to be a conservative. If you're a Democrat, you're much more likely to be a liberal. I mean, there are a few people who get closer in the middle, but there's no overlap. The most conservative Republican, let's say, how do we put that? Well, essentially, there's no overlap. There's the most liberal Democrat, rather, the most conservative Democrat is still more liberal than the most liberal Republican, if I got that right. No overlap. Now, since these findings, there have been 3 developments. First, this extension of ideological polarization into social relationships. Essentially, this is our social relationships are now fortified by ideology. This is the social polarization. Why has ideological polarization spread to social relationship networks from friends to coworkers to neighbors? So most of the people we talk with share our views. Essentially, this is what happened. Ideological polarization influenced issue polarization, that is, people were divided on issues. The parties came along later. They were polarized in ideological terms. And finally, the bottom component here is social polarization. It's finally seeped into all these social networks that we have. Likes, and the core reason here can be stated at the top. Likes like likes, and likes dislike unlikes. So follow that. So if whatever characteristic you have, you're favorably disposed to others who share that characteristic, that viewpoint. You want to be reinforced. It's comfortable. You think you're right, so why hang around with people who are wrong? You know, and they dislike the unlikes. They're deplorables, or they don't share your characteristics. So there must be something unsettling about them, maybe even defective about them. I think that, and we see all kinds of social psychological theories over the years that essentially point in this direction. People want to feel comfortable in their relationships. And to feel comfortable is to feel reinforced. Association, we saw the sort of birds of a feather flock together, the old saying. And we saw in Diana Mutz's research that people talk to people like themselves. And, the only place where she found that broke up a little bit in the old days was in workplace relationships, where you didn't have a choice of who you talked with. Your co-workers, you might over the water cooler or, at lunch, you might talk about politics briefly, and you didn't get to pick them. But when you have a choice, people pick people like themselves to talk with. Selection biases. What kinds of media do you listen to? We selectively expose ourselves to different media. We perceive things that are consistent. We evaluate things in the most favorable ways. So essentially, we're our own spin masters. Making things seem as consistent with our political views as possible. And we tend to remember things that are also reinforcing. There's a resistance to persuasion. Some of the earliest voting studies looked at did people change their minds over the course of the election. They're bombarded with all this campaigning. Do they change? No, they don't. Very few people change their minds. And partly it's because they listen to what they want to listen to. Cognitive consistency and dissonance reduction effects. So all of it, and most recently, there's been research on the confirmation bias, that people tend to look for information and pay attention to information that confirms their pre-existing views. So all of that is, I think what's behind it all is a search for comfort. That people are just more comfortable. They don't want to spend their time arguing with other people, right? That's work. And, it exposes yourself. Maybe you don't know everything. They have all the information right at your fingertips to battle back. And actually, there's some research at Harvard on implicit association testing of unconscious biases. Very interesting. You can check out do a Google search and check that out. But people tend to associate favorable terms with people who share character, even physical characteristics like themselves. And it's likely this. Whites do it. It applies racially, but in terms of gender and you name it, there's this implicit, unconscious tendency to associate good things to people like yourself who share the same characteristics, and associate less favorable characteristics to those who differ. So throughout this, we see that pattern. Several changes have increased the social contagion of polarization. That is, have particularly increased this. Greater intensity of ideological polarization differences. As we become more ideologically distinct, the pressure to not talk with people who disagree with you is greater. I mean, you know, the arguments are not going to be just little differences anymore. They're going to be big differences, and that's even less comfortable. Changes in the economy and the workplace, and more opportunities for choice, and where choice is an option, people choose similarities. Advances in communications, you know, the social networking and all of that is again, more choice, more consistency. We're building our silos for ourselves, and we're being given the implements to do it. And so again, social media is part of it. Where there is greater choice, there's greater confirmation and reinforcement. And then there's peer pressure beyond that. So that is, you know, if people you choose as your peers, people you want to have the respect of, if they think one thing, you're going to be less likely to challenge them, more likely to go along, kind of go along to get along. Second development, it's ideological social polarization is aligned with the distribution of power. This is where we start getting close to the crisis. An ideologically fortified class structure. Essentially, we get something like a ruling class developing out of this. Again, we have layers of this pervasive polarization, starting with ideological values, extending to issue values, party identification, and now into non-political social relationships. That is, who we work with, who we associate with, who we're in groups with, occupational, where we live. All of these things tend to be confirming. Again, it's the silo effect is being created. And this is a big part of the crisis. These tend to be associated with power. The establishment of, there's the establishment, there's sort of the ruling class, the college-educated, managerial class, those people who own business, who run business, who make decisions about you know, what information is passed along and what information is not, how it's passed along. All of those, sort of the upper class, not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of power over other people, versus average Americans. So this is really the core now of this pervasive polarization, us versus them. It seems like my 50 minutes is up, but I'm going. So just nearing the end here. So essentially we have a feudalism sort, a new class politics of the two ends against the middle. At the upper, for the Democrats, we have sort of the creation of an establishment globalist party. More educated establishment, upper class, upper middle class, who dominate the permanent government, high tech, managerial class, journalism, science, and education. They're all moving to the Democrats. Plus, at the other end, almost like the old feudalism, there is a government-dependent poor. Sort of these are the beneficiaries of the kind of noblesse oblige of the establishment liberal Democrats. And on the conservative side, we have more of a populist nationalist party developing. Trump was sort of the leader of that, but I think it was going to move in that direction anyway. So a less highly educated middle class and working class, and it's across race and ethnicity. Some NBC polls over the last 10 years show working class, blacks, whites, and Hispanics all moving in the Republican direction. But there were signs of this early on. That there was so the Republican Party is becoming the new party of the common man. But we saw this early on, back in the days of McGovern, the Never McGovernites and then later the Reagan Democrats, and of course what Obama called the bitter clingers and what Hillary called the basket of deplorables, was all elements of this class division that had been created or was being infused with our ideological polarization. So this is another way to see what's going on. At the higher so we have a liberal conservative dimension here, and at the higher end of socioeconomic status, on the vertical axis, we see the establishment and their aspirants moving toward the liberal side. In the middle class and working class moving from the liberal side more to the conservatives, and the one static group is the government and the government workers and the dependent poor, or the government-dependent poor, the beneficiaries of the welfare state, basically staying with the liberal, more Democratic Party. So that's the division. So what we have, and this figure shows it pretty well, is the public is polarized. And maybe tilts a little bit more in the conservative direction, but the public's polarized. The elites have now becoming more orthodox left-wing in backgrounds. Information, education, entertainment, corporate, sort of that ruling class is becoming more left-wing. That creates an emboldened, because both are operating kind of in, or actually the elites are working more in a bubble in their own silo. They've become emboldened, right? Because if you're only hearing from people like yourselves, you think you're right. You're more and more sure that you're right, and the other side is wrong, and that emboldens you. The conservative, more working class now is becoming more alienated from this. They wonder, why are we being pushed in one direction and not another? So we have institutional orthodoxy has intensified the polarized conflict in American politics. And I think this is Elon Musk's stick figure drawing. Actually, he didn't draw it, but he used it to suggest what he thinks is happening. But it's not out of kilter with what I found either. So the spectrum is increasing, and some on the left have moved further to the left. I think you might make a case that some on the right have moved further right as well at the same time. So this brings us to the last of the developments, the crisis of a decline in democratic civic values. Most Americans believe our democracy is under attack. So we understand that there is a crisis. This is from the NPR's Ipsos survey in 2021, December 2021. 64% of respondents said agreed that the American democracy was in crisis and at risk of failing. And it's pretty much true for both Republicans and Democrats. 70% of Republicans, 67% of Democrats. The independents are not quite as convinced, but still 60% of independents think that there's a crisis. So we know there's a crisis. We're coming at it from different directions, though. In terms of patriotism, there's been a decline in patriotism. Gallup asked people, are you extremely or very proud of being an American? And then they had options of somewhat proud or not proud at all. In 2001 through 4, summarizing those polls, 90% were extremely proud. That's down to just under 69% now. So that's a decline of better than 20 points in this. Political tolerance has also declined, mostly among liberal Democrats, and we've seen the lack of civility and cancel culture, retributions, political censorship, safe spaces, and so forth. This is the survey evidence of this. This was the Cato Institute asked a national sample, would you support or oppose firing a business executive from their job if it became known that they privately donated money to the party you don't like, presidential candidate of the party you don't like? So among very conservative respondents, 22% of conservatives, 36% of very conservatives favored firing a business executive if they contributed to Biden. On the liberal side, that was 43% and 50% favored firing a business executive if he or she contributed to Trump. So there's a lot of intolerance for private contributions going the other way. The political climate today prevents me from saying things I believe because others might find them offensive. Conservatives fear retribution. 77% of very conservative, or conservative fear that. Liberals, many liberals fear that as well, but those who are very liberal are the least likely to hold back their views. But still, 62% overall are concerned that they can't say what they think, that there's going to be retribution. And finally, trust in institutions has declined. And also trust in authorities. And here we see, this is the Pew Research Center. Back in 1960, 75% of Americans said they could trust the government in Washington to do what is right just about always or most of the time. 75%. That's now 25%. So trust in government has declined. You can see, there have been times where it bounced up a little bit, but overall the patterns on the downswing. And we can see also in institutions of authorities, trust has declined as well, particularly among Republicans. This is from a Pew Research Center study asking people about their confidence in scientists to act in the best interest of the public. And this study was done in 2021. Among Republicans, 36% said they had not much or no confidence in scientists to act in the best interest. Liberals or Democrats, on the other hand, were overwhelmingly confident in these authorities. Now, why is that? I think there's an ideological basis for this. This is a Pew Research Center study of the American Association for the members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, almost a sample of 3,700 plus members, scientists who are members of the association. And we can see the study was done in 2009 and then again in 2014. Liberals, among scientists, liberals outnumber conservatives by about 6 to 1. So if you're being told, do you trust a group, and you know or have reason to suspect, rightly suspect, that the group is coming at things from a very different perspective than your own, you're going to be less trustworthy, right? And that's natural. We know people select their associates by, to some extent, and perhaps unconsciously, but to some extent by whether they conform or have similar views to their own. Why would we expect that conservatives would trust or just be willing to assign over trust to a lot of liberal scientists? Again, that's, and we know, again, I think most people think if somebody has a particular point of view, it gets into what they tell you. that people are not pristinely able to keep their own views out of it. Even hardcore scientists, it's going to, what questions they ask, how closely they look at things, it's going to have an effect. We see it also with respect to education. Republicans are not don't have a positive view, or fewer Republicans have a positive view of colleges and universities now. And we can see that this dropped from 2012 to 2019. It dropped 20 points. Democrats, 2/3 of Democrats have a positive view of colleges and universities, and only 1/3 of Republicans now do. Why is that? Again, the ideological basis, there's an ideological basis for this. This was back in 1990. This was the ideological division of professors at universities. There's the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA did a study, this is 1989-90, 35,000 plus professors indicated their ideological views. 42% were liberal, 18% were conservative. Now look what's happened. 2017, close to 60% of professors now say that they're either liberal or far left, and only 12% say they're conservative or far right. So essentially, there's been, at this institutional level, there's, instead of, while society's being polarized, these institutions are becoming orthodox. And there has to be a pretty big tension between that. So for every one conservative professor, there are 5 who say they're liberal or far left. Now, the final point that I'll make is that there's the liberal tradition in America by Louis Hartz, back in the 50s, explained American exceptionalism or moderation because we didn't have a feudal past, unlike Europe. Europe had a socialist movement and also had an aristocratic conservative opposite, battling that. We didn't. We were, going back to de Tocqueville, we were a very democratic society in that, with more class mobility and so forth, and people didn't have titles and so forth. That's, I think, in danger of changing. America enjoyed a Lockean liberal values of freedom, avoiding the ideological strife in Europe because we lacked a feudal past. Now we appear to be developing a feudal present and are experiencing the long-avoided ideological strife and I think the attendant threats to Lockean liberal values that we see in tolerance and trust in institutions. So that's the way I see it, and that's the way it is, as Walter Cronkite used to say, or at least as I see it. So I guess we'll take questions after a break. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome back. I hope you had enough time to enjoy some cookies and coffee and lemonade and a little bit of sunshine, because we've been short of that lately. I now want to introduce Sylvia Paxton, who is a member of the Summer Lecture Committee, who has worked in particular to recruit Jim Campbell. Thanks.
Lots of great questions. Thank you. Anne, how much time have we got here? 45 minutes. So there's the big $50,000, $60,000 question of what do we do? When do you want, how much time do you want for that one?
Oh.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, actually, there's no good answer for that.
All right. Well, I'll do it at the end. Okay.
Maybe I could suggest one thing. I mean, I think this could resolve itself. Again, the polarization happened in the public. They control it, and they can control its closure too. If there was a realignment for some reason, that is, if they decide one side is preferable to the other, then I think that shifts the balance and gives. And that could happen. We saw in the past, Americans had been evenly divided and quite polarized after the Civil War, before the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, because we don't want to go through the Civil War to break the balance. But after the Civil War, Democrats and Republicans were pretty evenly balanced up until the 1890s, where after Grover Cleveland's second presidency, there was a shift to the Republicans. So William Jennings Bryan, the Democrat, I think, pushed a radical agenda a little too far, and the performance of the Cleveland administration in leading into a depression after, or a panic after 1894, I think pushed people to the Republican Party. So that kind of resolved it for a time. So that could happen again.
Please define feudal and explain how America is becoming feudal.
Well, what I meant by that is that there's a class that has a power over, has a range of powers over average Americans. There is a sort of a ruling class. Now, at least in one sense, that's democratically determined who's in that class and who are the leaders. But there's also a lot of social and economic aspects to that. So big tech, for instance, was able to control political communications in the 2020 election to a great extent, journalism. So education, all of these institutions have powers over everyday Americans. So I think that's the feudalism. There are no particular titles that go with it. It's not inherited in that sense, but there is a definite power relationship.
This is from Lucas in New Haven. If we are becoming feudal, liberal elites, conservative workers, in reality, how do we explain how control of the GOP control of 30 states and the Democratic control of 17 states?
Well, you still have a lot of Republicans. The Republicans and Democrats are nearly equally balanced, and in terms of states, the Republicans are more widely dispersed since they live in less population-dense areas, and that's why we have a breakdown or a discrepancy between the Electoral College and the popular vote. That the Democrats are concentrated, particularly California. They can run up the score there. I mean, they get the advantage. The Democrats get the advantage of the winner-take-all aspect of California, but they don't get any additional advantage from winning it by a large margin with a lot of votes or winning it just narrowly. And so that's I think why Republicans are spread out more evenly throughout the country are able to do well. in elections.
So this is from Amanda. It's sort of from University of Georgia in Athens, where I'd like to say Jim got his
Was my first job.
His first job and where he got his first tenured position.
Yeah.
Amanda asks, sort of related, to if you would talk about the urban-rural divide.
Well, that's a pretty open question. There's clearly an urban focus, or a lot of Democratic groups live in cities, and partly that's minorities, but it's not just that, and so Democrats have had their strength there, and again, I think it goes back to this, and of course, more rural areas are populated by Republicans for the most part, but it goes to this people wanting to associate with people like themselves, and in occupations, they get into occupations that tend to be dominated by, increasingly, by people with similar points of view. And so whether that's in universities or other businesses that tend to be located in urban areas, more professional class, lawyers and doctors and so forth, that tends to be where Democrats are concentrated.
In education, we used to teach critical thinking and debate. Educators weren't foisting their views on students as they do today. We invited diversity of opinion, and why don't we do that anymore?
Well, I think that has to do with sort of the kind of a normal human, what appears to be a normal human impulse to surround yourself with like-minded people and to go into professions that are hospitable to your points of view. And that causes a breakdown in this kind of competition of ideas and free expression. One of the slides I showed was the differences in college and university professors by ideology. If there's a 5-to-1 advantage for liberal professors versus conservative professors, it stands to reason that a lot of conservatives would opt not to put themselves in that position, would be quiet if they were. I reviewed a piece at one point 8 or 10 years ago about how can conservative political scientists survive. And basically the advice, which I found very disconcerting, was they should keep their heads low. They should not be clear about what their political views are. And they could then pass as possible liberals. And while I understood some of the practical, you don't want to, if you're taking on a fight and it's 5-to-1 against you, they're probably not going to come out very well. And the thing is, 4 of those 5 could be perfectly professional and try to restrain their political views completely and act just as a professional. But it only takes a small group to make your life hell, and especially when, like, journals, if you get one negative review in a journal article, that generally throws you out. And one negative vote on tenure or promotion, and that can cause you a lot of problems. So, remind me again what the question was. I got spun off there a little bit.
The question was, why aren't we teaching critical thinking and debate anymore?
Right. Well, I think that's it. Once it's so lopsided, the spiral of silence takes over. Who wants to fight those kind of wars when it's not an even battle. And this undermines so much of what academics do. So much depends on peer review. If you have the peers stacked for you or against you, that distorts the whole process. It's like having a jury that's on one side or the other. You need some real competition, and sort of normal human inclinations to surround yourself with like-minded people causes a breakdown of that. I mean, academics need real diversity, the diversity of viewpoints. And I don't know how you ensure that. You can't have affirmative action for conservatives. But we need to do something at least to appreciate the need for greater tolerance of different views.
So, Jim, that really relates to college and university-educated people in the population. But the majority of Americans are not college and university trained. How do you get this kind of diversity training among people who aren't highly educated?
Well, the problem is true among highly educated people as much as it is among everybody who likes to surround themselves with like-minded people, whether you're a PhD or whether you just get through grade school. So people like to be around others like themselves. I think what we need to do is encourage and perhaps teach the importance of listening to the other side, and you have to be able to ensure tolerance for dissenting views, and so you really have to work on rebuilding the civic culture, I think, of the country.
And we don't teach civics in schools anymore, and certainly the way I was taught, I had a whole year of civics in high school.
I think it would be a great thing if there was simply a course on citizenship that all students, what does it mean to be a good citizen? And a big part of that should be what does tolerance really mean? Doesn't mean you have to accept any views. It's just you have to respect the right of others to have their own views and express their own views. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to listen to it. But just don't punish it. I've heard from students, in public opinion classes, well, if they say something, there are going to be consequences. Well, there are consequences that are allowable under tolerance. As you can tell them why they're out of their minds, or tell them why you think they're wrong, or don't listen to them. But if you try to punish them, you try to take away their job or cancel them in some way, that is intolerance. I mean, no matter what the view is, just rebut it. That's more free speech is the answer to bad free speach. Or just don't listen to it. Turn the channel. I guess you don't turn the channel anymore. I mean, you click the channel, but that's what we should be doing.
In today's America, what are the major factors that determine political ideology? Well, let me tell you what I think ideology is about. It's basically an attitude toward the use of governmental powers, whether it's a first resort or a last resort, and how expansive you think the public interest is. Whether you think it just could be good. If it helps some people, that means you're much more expansive. If you think it has to truly be